some people say, no, a vodka martini is a real martini. So then you've
Wow,
got the
yeah.
two. And then you have the people that say that anything in a martini glass is a martini.
Okay. All
And
right.
that's
Well,
what most people think of them,
all right. Well,
which is wrong. But
yeah. Well, we're live, and so your
oh, we are.
description, yeah. Um,
We're talking about
but that's
martinis
okay.
already.
It's it's happy hour at the end of the world, so we need to learn a
Mhm.
little bit about drinking.
Right.
Um, you haven't given us
We're all
a
gonna die, so drinks.
yeah. Yeah, we're all gonna die, but the question is, are we gonna come back?
Oh, good question.
Um,
And are we talking the Buddhist sense of the term?
no, a resurrection sense of the term. From a Buddhist
Mm.
perspective, yeah, we're all going to come back. Or not, I don't know. From a Hindu perspective, yes, we're coming back.
Mm-hmm.
It's like just changing clothes. From a Buddhist
Right.
perspective, it's a dissolution of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a solvate coagula, right? You
Kinda.
dissolve and kind of come back together
Mm-hmm.
a
Uh,
little different.
yeah, but with different parts, so there
Yeah.
may be some aspect of a previous
Right.
incarnation, but not necessarily.
Right. But it also kind of depends on the type of Buddhism, true.
Yeah, that's true.
Right. Yeah.
That's true.
But I think we're a little off track already.
Yeah, because we're talking about the Easter apocalypse today.
Yep. Yep.
And so we are firmly grounded in the Jewish and Christian traditions.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought a good place to start. First, I want to welcome both of you,
Hmm.
Stephanie and Jeremy. Thank you for joining me.
Yeah. Thank you
Wouldn't
for
be
having
the
us.
well, it wouldn't be the
Yeah.
cocktail apocalypse without the two of you.
Right.
Um,
It'd just be drinking alone.
Yeah.
which
No one
I
wants to
do.
see that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no one live streams that. So how are you two doing today?
Wow, doing just fine. Just fine.
Yeah,
Peachy.
yeah. All right. Well, and I'm
Excited to learn what you guys know about this sort of thing. Because to me, I don't know what's apocalyptic about Easter.
mm. Well, my response was, well, Easter is the apocalypse.
Right.
Yeah, but I imagine a lot of people have that same kind of question. What is apocalyptic about Easter?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's a history to it in many ways. And so I thought that before we get to the New Testament stuff, we could maybe spend a few moments going over some of the historical context that
Mm-hmm.
led up to the Easter event, I suppose, because none of this happens in a vacuum. There
Right.
was prophecy, but in general, I think that it's important to also be mindful of some of the terms like Messiah and ideas of resurrection and ideas of apocalypse out of the Jewish tradition because
Mm-hmm.
Jesus was a Jew. And I think
Right.
that's important to, kind of
Mm-hmm.
stress as well. I do that in class. Jesus wasn't a Christian. Jesus
Right.
was a Jew. He was born a Jew. He lived a Jew. He died a Jew.
Right. And
Um,
if Christ was
so,
a Christian, does that mean he worshipped himself? Yeah, it doesn't
no.
make sense, does it?
Well, it doesn't make sense either if he's God. Who's he praying to? Is
Mm-hmm.
he just having conversations with himself? But that is a different question. Um,
It makes me
so,
wonder about my social life then too.
yeah. Um, from a Jewish perspective, well, just even larger, I think that the context of the entire Bible, of the Old Testament and the New Testament, is a response to these systems of oppression and domination.
Hmm.
That is the whole story throughout, I think. And you have, especially in the Hebrew Bible / Old Testament, these, it's just, one empire after the other that
Hmm.
comes in. So we've got Egypt, Assyria, Egypt again, Greece, and then Rome. And what you have is this narrative of the unified Israel and Judah that is unified under David. And that was seen as the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham that they would have the land of Israel. But you had Israel in the north, Judah in the south. And David was a Messiah. And the Jewish understanding of Messiah wasn't necessarily some supernatural figure. It literally meant someone or something that had been anointed. Because even a rock could be anointed. Jacob does that at Bethel. He anoints the rock, right? And what it meant was that David was favored by God. And I think even the language was almost like David was God's adopted son in some ways. And that was the model. That was the model of the fulfillment of the covenant, right? But of course, it didn't last because you had Assyria came in and conquered Israel in the north. And then eventually, Assyria falls to the Persian Empire, and then you have Persia coming in and invading Judah in the south. And so the empire, or the kingdom, I should say kingdom, it was never an empire, but the kingdom of David is demolished. But yet there was this promise, part of God's covenant, that the lineage of David would rule forever. Or at least that's how it was interpreted. And it was during the Babylonian exile that apocalyptic ideas begin to filter into Judaism. And you then get two dominant strands of thought, especially, and this is consistent when the Jews are allowed to go back to Jerusalem eventually, but that there was a messianic expectation, which was that you would get a new Messiah, but it was understood that it would be someone like David that would restore the unified Judah and Israel. And along with this messianic expectation, there was a apocalyptic expectation. And this idea, the terminology of kingdom of heaven, was understood as that unified Israel and Judah. It did not have otherworldly context to it. It simply was
entity.
Right.
Yeah, and the salvation of through the Messiah is a very earthly thing. It's not something that really has these otherworldly connotations. The saving of is communal. That everyone enjoys the benefits of this salvation. It's all Jews will participate in this.
Right.
And that's something that becomes very different when Christianity takes root.
Right.
Right.
And there was inherited in the connection to the Zoroastrian tradition these ideas of resurrection, that at the apocalyptic event, the dead would rise. And my understanding is in the Zoroastrian tradition, it was the physical body. And that's why they had it's not even the funerary practices that they had. They were called pillars of silence, or dogmas, I think the correct term is. And they would just lay the body out on top of this like pillar, and then vultures would come and pick it apart, and then the bones would fall through, and you had to have those bones there. You wouldn't do cremation. You had to have the bones because there had to be something physical to resurrect.
Okay.
Right. And so these ideas get absorbed into the Jewish tradition. And then we have these prophets that appear. And, the prophets aren't all at the same time. Some are, prophesizing to Israel before it falls. Most of them are talking to Judah before it falls. But then you have some that are after that. And they have that message of the messianic expectation and the apocalyptic expectation.
Hmm.
And I think that is the context to understand Jesus, because Jesus was an apocalyptic Jewish preacher.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Now, did I miss anything in that? Or anything
Well,
you want to add?
there are
Well, I just
layers. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
no, I was just going to ask. So, talking about the messianic portion of it,
Mm-hmm.
Christians have this understanding of the Messiah being Jesus,
Right.
but this older messianic tradition is more of somebody who's anointed, so that
Mm-hmm.
even a rock could be anointed, right? So,
Right.
is that the type of messianic tradition that we're talking about here? Is a physical person who's coming along to restore the kingdoms?
Yes. Not a
Okay,
rock, but a physical person like
right,
David.
right. A rock person? I don't
Yeah,
know.
precisely because it was interpreted, that God's kingdom would rule forever.
Hmm.
And, the big question was at the time of the Babylonian exile and the fall of Judah, it was like, well, but wait a minute. God said that David's kingdom would last forever, and it didn't last
Hmm.
forever. So
Right,
what's going on here? So it got reinterpreted that
right.
Hmm.
the kingdom would always be available to the
Hmm.
lineage of David.
Okay, okay.
Yeah. But regardless what the Messiah was going to do, in addition to restoring the old kingdom, was kick out the oppressors.
Right. Okay.
Because that's the context again for the entire Bible, is these systems of domination and oppression.
Hmm.
And
Okay.
that's also why when we look at the Gospels, it's very important that we have that beginning where the begats. So you trace Jesus's line back to David.
Right.
Right.
Jesus must, or any Messiah must come from the line of David,
Okay.
right?
That makes sense.
So if he's not, then he's not really the Messiah.
Right.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah. And I think it's Matthew that even goes beyond that and traces him all the way back to Abraham.
Hmm.
Yeah,
To really make him Jewish, right? You can't
Right.
get more Jewish
he's
than
he's
that.
really the one. He's
Yeah,
really the
yeah,
one. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, and so at the time of the emergence of Christianity, and I think it's important, and we're going to talk about a lot of these things. We'll get into some of the details here. But I think it's really important to keep in mind that, um, one, the oppressor at this time was Rome,
Hmm.
um, and that early Christianity was very diverse. And so
Yes.
I tend to use the language instead of Christianity for what we're talking about today. Rather, I usually refer to the Jesus movement or
Yeah.
Jesus movements, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, I think that's really important to this story. That I think we all think that Christianity, as it appears today, was very much like it appeared back then, and it wasn't anything like it. We
Right.
probably wouldn't recognize a lot of it.
Hmm.
Um, there's one strand of it that really survives it and is canonized, and that's Paul's version of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's really um, something that comes in about 300 years later with Constantine,
Mm-hmm.
who's trying to
Right. Right.
unify an empire. And so, as he's trying to unify this empire, he's like, "Well, we've got to get rid of all these other
Mm.
strands of it. We have to canonize what the correct version is,
Right.
and get rid of the rest." And that's pretty much what
So,
they did.
religion as a tool of the state. I
Mm.
wonder what.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Strange.
Yep. Yeah. So let's maybe spend a few moments talking about the texts themselves, because I think that this is something that a lot of people don't know in terms of like dating and things like that. So then we can get into the details. And Stephanie, I know you've got a lot to add here. But
Uh,
the writings of Paul are the earliest writings,
yes.
and then followed by the Gospels.
Hmm.
And the Gospel accounts are not eyewitness accounts, and they never claim to be.
Right.
Mark is the earliest, and so Mark was written around 70 of the Common Era.
Hmm.
I think Paul's dated to about 50, right? So this would have been about 15,
Yeah.
25 years is the window for his writings after
Mm-hmm.
the death of Jesus.
Yeah.
And then I think Matthew and Luke are about 80 to 85 or 85 to 90, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
And I think John's it's the baby in the
Yeah.
room, right?
Yeah. John is like somewhere between like 90 and 110
Right,
BCE.
right,
Maybe even 120. We're not quite sure.
right.
Wow.
And
Um,
the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation, actually predates John, is my understanding.
Wow. I did not know that.
Yeah. It was not
That's
because it's the last in the book doesn't mean that it was the last
right.
written.
Right.
yeah. And there's questions as to his exile.
Hmm.
If the one who wrote the book of John, John of Patmos, we say, was truly exiled, or you know, if it was
Literary fiction.
not really a fiction, but like he had to go away, but not necessarily to a place that
Got it.
was isolated
Hmm.
and terrible for survival. There are accounts that there was a thriving community on Patmos. So,
Okay.
uh, you know,
Yeah. Yeah. And the other, the Mark, Matthew, and Luke are, we're just getting all academic-y here. Those are the synoptic gospels because
Right.
they have a very similar view, and John is the outlier. John was
Hmm.
mhm,
always seen as the spiritual gospel. But in particular for Mark, Matthew, and Luke, we really don't know who the authors were. Those
yeah,
names are just tradition.
Hmm.
mhm,
So it's anybody's guess. But there were a lot of texts in circulation.
Hmm.
And fortunately, we now have access to a lot of those texts, especially
mhm.
with like the discovery of Gnostic texts at Nag Hammadi and
Hmm.
various others. But what we're going to focus on today, for the most part, I think we're going to get into the Gnostics a little bit,
Mhm.
are the four canonical Gospels and Paul. So Paul is, what's interesting is, well, none of them, the gospel authors, they probably would not have known the historical Jesus.
Mhm.
Right.
Paul certainly didn't know the historical Jesus. Paul says he never met the historical Jesus.
Hmm.
But Paul has an experience of the risen Christ. And do we want to, let me ask this, do we want to go start with Paul, or do we want to look at the Gospels and what the Gospel narratives have to say about the resurrection?
Uh,
Well,
maybe go with the Gospels first,
Okay. All right. So
or
what?
what were your thoughts, Jeremy? I'm sorry, I didn't
I
mean to
just
cut
want
you
to say,
off.
yeah, that sounds like a great place to start
Okay.
Okay.
because that's
So
what most people think of as the chronological order is
right,
the Gospels.
right. So what do the Gospels have to say? Are the Gospels consistent with the resurrection? How did the Gospel writers view the resurrection?
Well, the first one we have is Mark, which is written around 70, as you mentioned already, and um, the flavor of Mark is, I think, quite different from the other synoptics because um, his Jesus is a more like a raw, humanized Jesus.
Hmm.
Um, if we look at specifically like the Garden of Gethsemane, where we begin the Easter story, where he goes with his apostles out to Gethsemane, and he's telling them to, stay awake here, and I'm gonna go off and pray. And this Jesus is very human. He's going through something. He's in true agony, and he's just kind of destroyed by this idea that he's going to have to die in
Hmm.
a
Yeah.
pretty horrible way. He's going there. He throws himself to the ground, and he's like, well, "Why do I have to do this? Please take this away from me." And um, that's not how we see Jesus in the garden in Luke and Matthew. He's much more controlled. He's more admonishing his apostles rather than going through this terrible thing. So Mark really has this really humanized Jesus who goes through this whole passion, and he cries out, Father, Father, why have you forsaken me? He's just destroyed by all this. And then when we go to the bit with the resurrection, we get this very one paragraph of what's going on there after he's dead. His female followers, Mary Magdalene, his mother, Salome, they go to anoint the body, and here there's no body there, and they find an angel. They tells them not to be afraid. He has risen, and tells them to go to the apostles, go to his followers, and tell them what has happened. But they're terrified, and instead of telling them, they just leave. and that's really where the Gospel of Mark ends, where they're fleeing in terror. We have an additional something added on a couple centuries later, where he appears to Mary Magdalene again, and now she does go to the apostles, and no one believes her. She's really the one that believes, and the women are the ones who believe that he is risen, but no one else really believes them until he appears to them. So we have this interesting gospel account that really only the women were the ones who believed him, and it's a terrifying thing. They're fleeing, but in this, we look at the historical context for when it was written, right? And it's written at this time when either they're in the middle of this Jewish war, or it's written right after it. We're not sure which, but we have Rome coming in, we have Rome destroying the temple, and you have this very physically apocalyptic event occurring for the Jewish people at this time. And it coincides with this gospel. They don't know what's going to happen. They're in the middle of something, and it's terrifying. And I think we could see the account of Mark in terms of the razing of the Temple of Jerusalem by the Romans.
Right.
It begins with Nero, and then it ends with Vespasian. So there's this space where I think if we look back to Mark in his little apocalypse, and I think it's in chapter 14. Let me look real quick. I'm sorry, Mark 13, where we have this little apocalypse, and it's talking about what will come later, and it's, the stars are falling from the sky. He tells them to be awake. It could come like a thief in the night. And when we look at the little apocalypse in Mark, and we're getting all these details, it really could be that he's talking about Rome. Rome coming in. It's going to come like a thief in the night. It's going to be horrible, and I think there's no coincidence that this is exactly what happened during the sack of Jerusalem.
Right. As you were speaking, I thought that maybe we might want to back up just a little bit and add some additional context in terms of the when all this happened in the narrative in the Jewish tradition, because Jesus, for the most part, was not in Jerusalem. He was in the outskirts, and he was in Jerusalem for the Passover. And Rome did not like anyone stepping out of bounds. And you had, during Passover, all of these Jews flooding into Jerusalem for the Passover event to the temple. And so anyone who stepped out of line at all would immediately be arrested. And what did Jesus do? Started causing trouble.
Yep.
Yeah. So I just wanted to add that in there, and just to give a little bit more context. But yes, I think that Rome is. You have to consider Rome, and also I also want to point out that crucifixion was a Roman method of execution. And I think that this is important as we get in to some of the details a little bit later about what was resurrected. Because one of the things I read was, there's this idea that, Jesus was on the cross, and crucifixion was a nasty way to go.
Yeah.
It took days because you would be exposed to the elements, and you would eventually, I think, drown in your own bodily fluids. And the people who were crucified were left on the crosses as a warning. And it was very humiliating because essentially they were there for the carrion. They were there for the vultures and the dogs. John Dominic Crossan said that, the physical body wasn't raised, but it was eaten by dogs. And we actually have other comments of crucifixion in some of the other writings about that. And I mention this because there is this idea that Jesus was, and I think it comes out of Mark with Joseph of Arimathea, that he was able to, get the body and whatnot. But the Romans typically would have left the body there. And I know that sometimes people say, oh, well, they were just being sensitive to Jewish tradition, so they would have to take him down. Romans didn't care.
Right.
They were not being sensitive to Jewish tradition.
No, I mean they left the roads lined with crosses so that they were a warning to people: do not
Do not cross us.
violate. Yeah, do not cross us. Do not violate the law. It's very clear that in death the Romans would not have granted that just for Jesus.
Right. Well, and my understanding is that narrative that Rome was being sensitive to Jewish tradition really is connected with the attempt to blame the Jews for Jesus's death.
Right.
Rather than putting the responsibility solely on Rome.
And also the Romans had every reason to make an example of him because he's this ascetic preacher who really represented a threat to Roman power, and they're really going to make an example of that. They're not going to just let that one slide because they wanted to be sensitive to Jewish traditions. I think they've already shown that they weren't.
Right. Yeah. And there had been Jewish revolts before. I mean, the most famous one was the revolt by the Maccabees. So yeah, they're not going to put up with any kind of shenanigans.
No. This is a shenanigan-free zone for the Romans. They just weren't gonna take it.
Right. Yeah.
No, we ain't gonna take it.
Right. So Mark ends with kind of a mystery, right? There's an empty tomb, but we don't know where the body is. There's no mention of that, right? What about the other two synoptic gospels? What about Matthew and Luke?
Well, Luke has the, once that they are told that Jesus is alive, they go to the tomb, and Peter is the first one there. He sees that there's, nothing but the shroud lying there, and he doesn't quite know what to think at this point. Yeah. So we go through the whole. They're afraid. They're going to their private secret lair, and they're kind of meeting in secrecy, and it's it's a little different.
Yeah, which one was it that wasn't it was it Luke where no, it was Matthew where the disciples end up fleeing to Galilee after Jesus' death.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because in
Yeah.
Luke they hang out, and Jesus ends up showing up, and that's when we get the Pentecost story, right, in the book
Mm-hmm.
of Acts, right? Okay, yeah. But that's, I think all of this points to one thing is that the gospel narratives are not consistent.
Nope.
Mhm.
They're
So
they're very
strange.
different.
Yeah.
Um, and who ends up being, if we look at Luke, he kind of is this anointing of Peter
Mm.
as the leader. And if we look at the book of, if we look at the Gospel of John, it's really the one whom Jesus loved,
Mm.
uh, that we're pointed to as a special. He might not be the leader, but there's something special about him because he
Right.
believes immediately that
Mm.
this must be the Messiah. This was Jesus raised from the dead.
Right.
Where Peter is still in this kind of the first one into the tomb, but what's going on? What's happened? Where
Mhm,
John
mhm.
immediately knows. And so we have these competing authority narratives that show up, showing us that the the early stories, the early Christians had all sorts of different ideas about
Right.
this. This is something that occurred over time.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Bart Ehrman, in his book, How Jesus Became God, noted that the empty tomb is part of a later tradition.
mhm.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think John Dominic Crossan points out that it's very unlikely that you have this event that occurs, the death of the leader, and everyone's like freaked out and they don't know what to do and they stop believing
Mm.
until all of this sort of comes around. Jesus starts appearing to people,
Right.
and he challenges that, like, you're not going to have an entire group of people simply stop believing until Jesus shows up.
Mm.
So there's this um, sense that this took over a period of years. These stories coming together and such, and
Right.
Mhm, mhm.
and there was definitely would have been a contingency of Christians or early Jewish Christians who thoroughly believed that he was raised from the dead,
Mm.
or that he was who he said he was. And we constantly see in the Gospels where he's telling them, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to die, I'm going to be crucified, and I'm going to rise again on the third day. Well, if he's saying this, why are none of them believing?
Right.
So there's this idea that yes, they did believe, and there was a congregation, and there all these different competing stories started.
Yeah. One thing Ehrman points out that it never actually says that there was a 3-day resurrection. It could have been the day that he was pulled down from the cross. It could have been that first day. It comes in later that there was that 3-day period, but it never explicitly says so. But anyway, I think that one of the things that is important is when we look at the emergence of this this Jesus movement, excuse me, especially within Judaism, is that the belief in resurrection was primary. So we can't say, from a scholarly perspective, we can't say whether or not the resurrection actually happened. But what we can say is that early Christians believed that it did.
Mm. Okay.
But they had different views of it. They had very, very different views of what that resurrection was. And, to something that you said, Steph, is that, Jesus was like appearing to them, but even then they were doubting.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, well, come and touch me, poke me. And in one of the Gospels, he actually eats some fish, I think, to demonstrate.
Yeah. The he does something of a Last Supper ritual. When he meets the two disciples,
Right.
and it involves eating the bread and the fish, and it's somewhat ritualized in that context.
Yeah.
But yeah, the fish was important in terms of showing that he was human. He was in a body.
Right.
It wasn't just his spirit, and that may actually be in itself a competing story,
Hmm.
because we had Gnostic beliefs that it wasn't physical,
Right.
it was a spiritual thing. So this I can't remember if it's in the gospel or if it's in the Acts, but this is basically saying nope, he's physical, and so it comes out rather clunky a little, to try to push that point. And I think we see it in the epistles of Paul as well, where there's just this hard narrative that resurrection is physical.
Hmm.
And it's almost as if it's pushing against another narrative, right? that
Yeah.
that there is this other idea of it, and it's not physical. It's
Right.
symbolic. It's metaphor.
Right. Well, and there's, there's all these different ideas about whether it was a physical resurrection. Some thought that Jesus was just raised in spirit while the body was, rotting and decomposing.
Mhm.
In the bellies of dogs.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, just throwing that out there.
Yeah. No, that's okay. And what Ehrman says is that it's the later Gospels where there's more of an attempt to prove bodily resurrection. But to what Steph was saying, I mean, that's absolutely correct, because when we look at it, especially when we get to the letters of Paul, Paul's writing to these Christian communities and kind of in conversations like, sometimes, no, you don't get it right. And I think it's in the letter of Romans where he's actually saying, this is what I believe, because he's never been there before. And he's like introducing himself, to what's going on. But there were other questions, and, I want to kind of hang out here with the Gnostics and some of these early views. But there were the other big question was, not just what was resurrected, but what did it mean?
Right.
Yeah. So I'm not sure. I don't know if you know, Steph, or not, because we've been focused on the synoptic gospels. Do you know what John's view was? Was it a body? Was it a spiritual body?
I think for John it was a body,
Okay.
like a physical resurrection.
All right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just something that I read popped into my head was that one of the issues with us having this conversation is our understanding of spirit and body, because we have inherited, thanks to Rene Descartes in large part, this dualism that mind, soul, and body are two completely different things.
Right.
And I think it came out of the Ehrman book. He's like, yeah, but people back then, that's not what they viewed. Body and spirit were one.
Right.
It was unified.
Yeah.
So this whole conversation may be academic.
Yeah. Well, even then, they still had different ideas. I mean, even then, there was, it was the body was. I think this is what Paul is suggesting, is that the body will be made immortal. So
Mm,
it's not quite the physical body. It's a different kind of
Yeah,
body.
right.
a body that's been, purified,
Right.
right? And
Right.
John's really about that, right?
Yeah.
He's about the purification of the soul, especially when we look in Revelation. Um, it's those who have been made pure through the trials,
Mm,
that they're put through, and it, it really takes on an aspect of martyrdom too.
mm,
The dying for the beliefs because that's what's important.
right.
We're really given this idea that your body, um, your life here is not nearly as important as what comes afterwards. So there is this idea of spirit, but there is a connection between the two. There's
Right.
having to go through this purification process in the bodily context to rise again
Hmm.
in the spiritual context. you know so there's this merging of them.
Right. Um, but then we also have these other competing ideas, especially like with the Gnostics. And the one that always jumps into my head is the docetic Christ.
Mm,
And if I understand correctly, according to some of these Gnostic groups, that there were actually a couple of different persons for Jesus. So there was the physical Jesus, the body, but then there was this other kind of entity.
mm,
One of the things that I learned was that in some of the Gnostic understandings is that it was when Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist that's when the logos, the Christ Spirit, descended into his body.
mm,
So it would have been separate
mm.
from the physical Jesus. It would have been something that kind of entered into him.
Right.
And I think it's in the Apocalypse of Peter where you have the Jesus on the cross, but then the Christ Spirit appears to the disciples, and the Christ Spirit is actually laughing at the crucified one.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah.
Steph, do you have?
How do you follow that?
I'm sorry, did you?
Yeah,
I
well,
didn't hear.
I was just asking if you had anything you wanted to add about this, about the Gnostic or different Gnostic views, because even when we talk about Gnostics, even that was
Mhm.
diverse. There wasn't,
Oh yeah, because the Gnostics had no canon, right?
right,
They're telling stories
mm,
to help
Mm,
relate an idea. It's very
right,
metaphorical
yeah,
about what's going on. They would have thought that the bodily resurrection of Jesus was very distasteful.
yeah,
It was not something that they would even consider. Um, the Christ in for the Gnostics was in all of us. That's the story
yeah,
is something that we use to awaken the Christ within us.
right,
You know, so that whole thing isn't supposed to be taken in a literal context, but as a story to explain a higher truth,
mm,
and that
mm.
is
Okay.
we awaken to Christ within.
right,
The kingdom of heaven is within us. It's in the
Right. Right.
Gospels as well, but and you see it in there. But for the Gnostics, this was it. This was why that story exists, and there, as you said, all sorts of competing stories about it because it's just a story to understand um, these higher truths to unlock that within us. So yeah, they didn't care if the stories weren't all coordinated with each other because
right,
that
Right.
wasn't the point.
right,
Hmm.
Yeah.
yeah,
This
and
wasn't a literal history. This was more explaining truth through story.
yeah. Well, and I think that it bears, it's important to mention too, kind of how these texts came about because it was the first decades or few so after the death of Jesus, it was an oral tradition.
Right.
things were written down later. And during this oral tradition, people were sharing their memories of Jesus. And often it followed the pattern of the Greek banquets and the symposiums. Because at the banquet or the symposium, the way that it worked in Greece and then in Rome is people would come and there would be the washing of the hands and of the feet, and then they'd go in. Now in Greece and Rome, the seating was all it was a hierarchy to it, so it showed social stratus and status. But then there would be the meal, and then there would be drinking of the wine and the invocation of a god or gods. And this is the same pattern that happened in the early Jesus movement, that it was all with the food. And the big difference, the major difference between what Jesus did and what the early members of this Jewish Jesus movement did is they eradicated the social stratus, the social, everyone was welcome to the table. Everyone was there and everyone was equal. Right. But it still followed that kind of pattern where, they would have, and here it wasn't just a banquet, it was a memory of the Last Supper. And this eventually becomes the Mass. And then there was the drinking, but here, they would tell stories about Jesus and their memories of Jesus and what they loved about Jesus and what Jesus meant to them. But it's only later that they get written down.
Right.
Yeah. But then...
Yeah. Sorry, I was going to say that was so important to the early movement was this idea of both healing and community. So that idea of having supper together, was the crux of it. That community, that commensality.
Yeah. And I think that something that we haven't mentioned that's important to mention in connection to this idea of Easter as apocalypse is that the resurrection was kind of the apocalyptic event, right? It was the sign of the Messiah. It was the unveiling of a new world.
Yep.
Yeah. And, it's a terrifying thing too, because to me, there's different ways you could look at it, different layers you can look at it. But, if we're looking at it in a Gnostic sense, it's in terms of an awakening of the mind.
Right.
It's an awakening of who we are and that we're all equal brothers and sisters, right? That changes the whole strata of the whole social strata, and it's a threat.
Yeah.
I'm as important as you are. And I think in the Gnostic sense, they would actually also switch places, reenacting things, reenacting the story of Jesus. And, anyone could take that role, male or female. That's really revolutionary.
Yeah.
And I think in the more, as we think of it, the traditional context, it's, the apocalypse of losing Jesus and also the apocalypse of what comes next. What are we doing? I mean, what has been revealed to us is that there's this new order in which we don't answer to Rome, we answer to Jesus.
Right.
Right. And so.
Yeah.
Right. And that goes back to Nick's point about the whole story of the Bible as being counter oppression, counter dominance.
Yeah. But this is also why Jews did not accept some obviously accepted Jesus. That's why we have Christianity. But the overwhelming majority rejected Jesus as the Messiah because they're like, did you not notice what Rome just did to Jerusalem? If he was the Messiah, that probably wouldn't have happened. He never kicked Rome out. Although some, I think, will say, yeah, but let's fast forward about 300 years.
Yeah.
Hmm.
You know,
We're too close up right now. We're going to have to wait.
yeah. But I think that it was important because Jesus did say in a couple of different of the in a few of the gospels that like not a generation will pass.
Right.
So the expectation was, especially with this idea of resurrection, the expectation was that the apocalypse was at hand. You
Right.
weren't going to
Oh,
have to
yeah.
wait. You certainly weren't going to have to wait 2,000 some years.
Right.
And he even said, it's like not a, some of you are going to see this.
Yep.
You are
Hmm.
going to live through this, and they didn't.
Yeah.
Um,
Paul certainly believed it was happening
mm-hmm.
very soon,
Yeah,
and that's when we get back into that bodily resurrection. It
yeah,
was
Right.
Jesus was the first, and now it's just going to start rolling,
yeah,
and he'll return.
Hmm.
So
Soon.
it's a matter of then how is he going to return?
right.
Is it going to be in this sort of militaristic sense that we find in the book of Revelation? Or is it going to be something else, something
Hmm.
also in a more spiritual sense?
Right.
You know,
Right. And Nick, did you say Revelation was the earliest of those books that we've been talking about? Is written the earliest?
No,
Oh, okay.
Revelation was written earlier. We think that it was written before John.
Okay. Okay.
I don't think that it was. I don't think it was written before Mark.
Okay.
It may be a little bit contemporaneous with Matthew and Luke,
Okay.
but I'm not positive about that. And
So
on
it's still
some of
pretty early, right?
it definitely
So that
was not the last book written.
okay.
Um, the scholar Marcus Borg uh, put together a Bible of the best scholars can guess in terms of the dating of the actual letters and gospels and whatnot, so that you can actually read the biblical text in, as best as we can get, the order that they were written,
Hmm.
which is gives you a different perspective
Right.
than reading them in the order that we have them now.
Hmm.
Because when you read them in the order that they were written, you're going to start with Paul. You're definitely going to start with some of the letters of Paul. And it's going to give you a better view of this unfolding of this Jesus movement in history and how it happened.
Right.
Yeah. So, but some of the dates are, we have to guess, and
Right.
and
Right. Right.
the guesses are based on scholarship and deep understanding of the text and textual analysis and whatnot. But it's still, not 100% certain. Um, so, do we want to say more about Paul here? In terms of since we've talked about the Gospels, do we want to talk about more about Paul, who never knew the historical Jesus,
Right.
and his vision and his understanding? Because we've been talking about how he understood the resurrection as a spiritual body, which seemed to be
Right.
a
hmm
combination of physical and spiritual, but it was a immortalized body. It was a special kind of body.
yeah. I don't know. Paul's problematic in a lot of ways, but um,
Yeah, that's an
what we know,
understatement.
what we know about Paul is that he it's obvious he never met Jesus. In terms of, we don't get any of Jesus's backstory through
Right,
Paul.
right.
That all comes through the Gospels, where we're almost retconning Jesus, to different types of understandings of him. But you know, Paul never met him. We don't get that understanding of him. Jesus is a very different figure in the epistles
Mhm.
than he is in the Gospels. Um, and you know, I don't know what I really want to say about Paul.
Well, I think
Yeah.
and this may be a bit of diversion, a little bit, maybe, perhaps, I don't know. But there was a conflict between Paul and the early founders
Mm-hmm.
of the Jesus movement.
Hmm.
And the big conflict, I think, is the one with James, who we're told
Mm-hmm.
is the brother of Christ. And I read that as the physical brother. Mary had other kids after Jesus. She had other children. And there's this famous, I think it's in Acts, right? Where there's this disagreement between Paul and James. And James, the one who would have known Jesus, is like, you're getting it all wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, his understanding is contrary in some parts to the apostles,
Yeah.
right? Um, and we see that a bit in the Acts and uh, in the different letters that are coming out, because we do have the epistles of James,
Mm.
and it's just, yeah, there's a contention there, and it's a contention for authority.
Mm.
Who's the authoritative voice here?
Right.
And we see that in all the gospels. We see that in a lot of the letters where they're just trying to one up each other in terms of who's got the authority, and they'll go with tradition to a certain extent, and then twist it a little bit,
Mm.
as to who actually holds the authority there. So it will, you know, uh, I'm trying to think of the we have you know I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Go ahead.
That's okay. Well, and one of the things too, I think that is bears mentioning is that we've already discussed how the in the early Jewish movement, or this, excuse me, the early Jesus movement, that it was happening at dinners, you know, um,
Hmm.
and it was often wealthy people, especially wealthy women, that were opening their homes,
Hmm.
and who doesn't love free food? Everyone loves free food. But there, you had different writings and you had collections in the way that, and I forget where I got this, but that what happened is they would have like collections of texts and they would just like keep them in like a little basket or something. And there wasn't any kind of order, there wasn't any kind of agreement. My understanding is the very first New Testament was produced by the Gnostic Marcion. But it's not until 325 of the Common Era at the Nicene Council that they came to any kind of agreement. But even then, you had all these different views.
Hmm.
And finally, they're like, no, this is it. Anyone else is a heretic. And let's burn those writings, things like that. Um, uh,
I think one of the interesting things that we see, especially in Paul, is him kind of trying to put women in their place.
yeah.
Hmm.
There's a lot of that in there, of him just, no, you need to obey your husbands, um, and not talk so much. And when we see that, we kind of know that women must have been important,
Mm,
because you don't tell someone to shut up unless they're actually talking,
Right.
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 you know? And there are some who believe that the Gospel of Mark may have been written by a woman.
Hmm.
Hmm.
And the reason for that is that much more humanized version of Jesus, who's really
Right.
going through an agony. But also, when we get to the woman with the alabaster jar who anoints Jesus in there,
Mm-hmm.
she's the only one. After they're talking, he's talking about what's going to happen to him,
Right.
that he's going to be killed and all this, these terrible things are going to occur. And the apostles are all like, no, we don't. They're kind of in avoidance. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to go through it. And this woman, who a lot of people attribute to Mary Magdalene, but
Mm.
there's no actual source there that says it was her. Comes, she breaks open this jar and she anoints him, knowing that this is the last time he'll be able to be anointed.
Right.
Also, we have the women are the only ones who believe in the resurrection. So it's all
Yeah.
pointing to these women are the only ones who are actually believing everything about what's been said. So there are
Right.
some people some scholars who believe that Mark is probably a pseudonym for a woman.
Hmm. That's interesting.
Um, yeah. Uh,
Yeah.
I find I find it works in terms of Paul sitting there telling women to sit down and shut up,
Yeah.
because that's not what this is all about. This is a male thing.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because, well, I mean, one in the, I think it's the Gospel of Philip, the Gnostic Gospel. I could be
Mhm.
wrong, but I think that's the one where they have Jesus. It's clear that the favorite disciple is Mary Magdalene, and they have
Mhm.
Jesus like kissing her on the mouth. And I know there are
Mhm.
like little bits missing in terms of in the text that we have, so it's really uncertain where he kissed her. But I mean, the mouth is the safest one, uh, probably. Um, but yeah, it seems like that the yeah. The other thing is that Paul wasn't really taking this out to Jewish audiences. Paul was going to the
Mhm.
Gentiles, right? To the
Mhm.
Right. Right.
non-Jews.
Who also, I mean, the non-Jews, the Gentiles, when you had women there, were usually wealthy women, right? We
Right.
mentioned that before, and they seem to be very active and probably the reason why Christianity survived the first 300 years.
Yeah.
Because they were making it happen. They were granting those secret places for people to meet because they had the money.
Yeah.
So you're looking at Roman and Greek women
Hmm.
who were held a lot of power back then.
Yeah. And that's also why you have this Greek and Roman tradition of the banquet, um, so heavily influencing early Christian um, ritual, I guess. So you
Hmm.
want to
Hmm.
say, ritual of the mass and whatnot. Um, the other thing that I think that's important in terms of the biblical text in terms of the resurrection is, we've mentioned that there was a lot of doubt by the disciples, but what there was, and this again, I need to thank Bart Ehrman for this. And I know any fundamentalists, who may be watching, you never know, some might. As soon as I mention Bart Ehrman, they're like, devil, devil, devil. But he talks about, these visions of Christ, that these people had visions. And he's like, well, let's talk about this a little bit. What were these visions? And even if, one of the things I love, he's like, he uses the analogy of a ghost because there's this question of like the materiality. And he's like, well, yeah, but even if people see like a ghost in their house, there's a material component to it that
Hmm.
allows us to see it. And
Right.
so, this question of, and we've been kind of going around about this, about what was resurrected.
Right.
What was it? Was it like a ghost body? Was it a physical body? Was it just pure spirit? And if it's just pure spirit,
Ectoplasm.
how can you see it?
Right.
What's going on there? What's going on? But I think they eventually, it's like, no, no, no. This was physical body.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Certainly, certainly some context of Christianity. Then,
Yeah.
I mean, not all. It was in what survived to today.
Right.
Yeah, that physicality is important there.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, because that isn't that the idea that at the resurrection we will, will it be the physical or a spiritual body that's resurrected?
Hmm.
In Catholic belief, it is definitely like on the day of judgment, um, we rise bodily.
Okay.
It is a physical aspect of it. That's part of the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed,
Hmm.
is that we believe in the resurrection of the body
Right.
Hmm. Right.
and life everlasting.
Yeah.
You know,
Now.
it's
Amen.
it's it's a place,
Yeah.
I think, a new earth that eventually
Hmm.
uh, we inherit,
Right.
and
Right.
we're all immortal.
Yeah.
And
And
this may be a little bit tangential, but can I ask a question?
of
Because
course.
Jesus wasn't the first one in the Bible that came back to life, because
Right.
he raised the dead on several occasions.
Yeah.
So, is there a difference between what he did for them and what happened to him? And is there a discussion about that in earlier writings?
I
I,
don't know that there was a discussion of difference between like Jesus
Okay.
and Lazarus. It was seen as a sign of his divinity, I guess,
Right.
that he was
mhm.
able to do that. But it certainly didn't have the messianic connotations
Right.
that
Right.
Jesus' resurrection had.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
and I think yeah, that scene is to show his divinity, Jesus's divinity,
Yeah.
and Lazarus, who has risen. Um, I think I don't remember where it is. I'm sorry, but he does eventually die again,
Mm.
Right.
um,
Right. Right.
and that is recorded that he
Hmm.
lives a few years,
Mm.
and then
Right.
he dies again.
Right. And that was
Um,
clearly a bodily coming back to the dead. He came back into a body.
Yeah.
Right. Versus Jesus, we're still
yeah,
discussing whether that is what happened, or they were still
'cause
discussing
he
if that's
doesn't.
what happened.
Yeah, he doesn't really have a lot of time to decompose.
Yeah.
He's
Right.
but
Yeah.
they do say, Master, he's bound to really smell by now, because it's been a
Right.
few
Right.
days. And I think it's Kurt Vonnegut who goes on to say, I bet Lazarus wasn't all that happy about it, having been dead and brought back.
Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
what I think there's also that idea that when we die, we are in a sleep.
Right.
We may not be aware of anything during our death. So it's a little bit of a difference in how we think of death today.
Mm.
Like, death today would be, in terms of Christianity, um, we die and go to heaven or hell or purgatory, depending on what we believe and how we've lived our lives. But then again, we're going to rise again in our bodies
Mm.
at the end, at the judgment, right? But um, we do have this other existence in which we're in heaven or hell or wherever it is that we've been sorted to. But I think back then it was more like a belief in a sleep,
Mm.
that
Hmm.
I don't know if we're dreaming or anything like that, but we are bodily asleep and we're not experiencing heaven or hell or anything else. We're just asleep.
Well, shouldn't we also put this into the context of the Jewish tradition where there
Hmm. Yes.
really isn't a heaven or hell?
Hmm.
Hmm.
That it's a question. I mean, Jews are in disagreement as to whether or not
Hmm.
there's anything after this life. But in the biblical text, there was, I think, Sheol was kind of
Hmm.
like the underworld, but it was very kind of consistent with other visions of the underworld and other mythic
Right.
Yeah,
traditions.
Right.
it seems to be a lot more Greek in its understanding.
Mm, yeah.
Right.
There's this underworld in which uh, we have instances of people seeing others tormented
Mm.
in
Hmm.
Jewish text afterwards, after they die. And um, so there does, yeah, the idea of Sheol um, seems to be in connection with Hades.
Yeah.
That
Right,
that
right.
it's a life after death, but it's kind of like a half life,
Mm.
Hmm.
where we're not necessarily being punished
Mm.
um, or rewarded. It's just
Right.
an afterlife.
Yeah. Well, and I think that the Christian ideas of afterlife, if we want to look at how that developed, that change developed, we have to look at a couple of different things like Egyptian ideas of a judgment at the time of death, where we're judged on our acts, and either we have eternal existence with Osiris, or we are eaten up by the crocodile goddess, and our souls go into nothingness. But also, I would argue the Greek ideas, because you have Alexander, who conquers everything. There's a direct connection between him and Aristotle, and so we can then go, oh, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, and these ideas of an immortal soul. That there is something that persists of the
Hmm.
individual.
Yeah. Um, we also have those ideas of being reborn into a better life
Mm.
in in later Greek ideas. Like the whole idea that we go through those rituals here on Earth of the we were talking about it in a earlier episode. We the idea that we want a better rebirth in the next life. So I can't think of the the ritual. I think you the at least the
Eleusinian mysteries.
Eleusinian mysteries,
Yeah.
yes, in which we go through those rituals in order to have a better rebirth or
Mm.
a better afterlife and rebirth.
Right.
So, and that's missing in Christianity, the whole idea of rebirth, but I think the idea of a better afterlife is certainly there.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Although, I'm just going to throw this out there because this is who I am. There is this idea that the early Christian communities, especially the wine, when we think of the Greeks and the wine, their wine was not the same as our wine.
Mm.
Their wine was not $2 chuck or $3 chuck now, right? That there were other things mixed with it.
Mm.
And some of these things that were mixed with the wine, and the wine had to be watered down because otherwise it could be lethal. It had to be watered
Mm.
down. And we actually have some evidence because we have some of the cups and they've been able to trace what was in that wine.
Okay. Okay.
Some of what was in that wine was psychotropic.
Ooh.
And so, what does that do in terms of, this early, if that's
Right.
true,
Right. If that's
what
true.
does that do in terms of ideas of belief in an immortal soul? Because that's, like Steph was just saying, that was actually one of the big takeaways from the Eleusinian mysteries. You are
Hmm.
immortal, you know?
Mhm.
And so what happens if these early Christian, are there Christian, should we talk about Christian mysteries? And if so, where does that fit into what's going on in this Jesus movement within Judaism and in the Gentiles, which would be the pagan world?
Mm-hmm.
We certainly have the idea that uh, in this immortality of the soul
Mm.
is very important in Christianity. That our
Right.
souls, we might be damned for all eternity, but we still exist, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so there's this immortality aspect that comes into it all, that we are divine. We're not divine beings, but we are part of that everlasting aspect of what we are in terms of our souls or spirit. Um,
Isn't this weird? I mean, this just like popped into my head as you were speaking, but isn't it weird that people would rather have the idea of an immortal soul, but that you would have eternal damnation than nothing?
Mm-hmm.
yeah, yeah, that snuffing out of existence um, was not a thing. Yeah, we and not for Christians. I mean,
Right.
it that connection to ego, I guess. That,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
and I find
Which
it
is kind of
fascinating too. I'd rather not exist than be eternally damned. You know?
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
yep.
I don't want the butt spiders. Um,
but but you better. But that's also a reason to control, right?
yeah.
You better fall in line. You better do what you're supposed to do, or it's
Yeah.
eternal damnation.
Yeah.
It's a way to keep people in line in this life.
Yeah.
And
Right.
how very Roman,
Yeah.
actually, when I think about it.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't want people to question anything and to fall in line, and remember, if this world sucks, there's going to be something better
Mm.
afterwards. So
Right.
do what you're supposed to do is a great way to keep people in line.
Yeah.
You
Mm-hmm.
know, because something better is going to come later.
Pay your taxes.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, anyway, I know we only have about 13 minutes here left. I think the key point in terms of to go back to this original question of, well, what's apocalyptic about Easter, is this idea that there was within Judaism this idea of the end of an age and
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
resurrection. And it was believed by these early Christians that this was the end of the age,
Right.
and that
That it
there
was
was
happening in
something,
their
yeah,
lifetime.
yeah, that was happening within their lifetime. And I think that it's very fair to say that the resurrection was the apocalyptic event. That,
Right.
they're like, okay, this is it. We're going. Countdown.
Right.
We got
Right.
the
Yeah.
first one. Now it's just a matter. Let's wait, but it's
Mm-hmm.
going to happen. It's going to happen. Um, so, yeah. Anything else to add to this? Anything that we've forgotten or jumped over?
I think we might want to look at it as a new uh, a new understanding of the the archetypal image
Mm,
of the sun. The
yeah,
solstice symbolizing the rebirth of the sun,
right.
um, and it's a Jewish and Christian understanding of it, to be sure.
Mm,
Um, but if we look at it in that context, it really does follow. Um, you know, there's a reason why Easter and Ostara are usually around the same time, right?
right, right,
It's this rebirth. The sun is coming
Mm-hmm.
back,
Right.
um, and life is returning.
right.
So
Well, and it's not even that the sun's coming back, because that's what Christmas is.
Yes.
because the winter solstice is the rebirth of the sun, sun.
Right. Hmm.
And it seems to me that the spring equinox is the conquest of the sun
Hmm. Hmm.
because the
Yes.
days are getting longer after the
Right.
spring equinox.
Right.
Hmm.
Right. But yeah, and I think that those elements are there, and this may be way off the path, but I know that some like to suggest they're like, well, yeah, but look, there were other dying and rising gods, which is true. And
Yeah.
those gods or goddesses even were connected to the agricultural cycle, very much
Hmm.
so, and the cycle of
Right.
the seasons and the sun and whatnot. But there is something that's very distinct within the Jewish Christian narratives. And I think that if you just say, oh, yeah, well, Jesus is, it's the same thing as like Osiris and Dionysus and everything, although there may be connections and there may be similarities, there is something very specifically Jewish and specifically Christian about the Jesus story, and I think that when you kind of wave it away by saying, "Oh yeah, well, all these other gods and goddesses have come back," that you're missing that very specific context, and I think
Hmm.
it's really
Right.
important to keep in mind that context.
Right.
Yeah. In terms of um, the Gnostic understanding, it really is this rebirth of self,
Mm.
of understanding our our place in the cosmos, our that we come into this life as like wretched beings with this lead soul who transform ourselves into this gold soul, this thing that is, if you want to look at it alchemically, this perfection of the soul,
Mm.
and the Jesus story tells us how to get there. You have
Hmm.
to die to
Right.
yourself in order to rise to this new understanding, this
Yeah.
Christ within. Um, or if we look at the traditional sense, it's still this, whether we look at it, if we look at it in terms of we've been saved,
Right.
we once we're all going to be condemned to eternal damnation, and now
Mm.
we are um, now we partake in the resurrection through Jesus Christ, and we come into this as you know new newly refreshed, newly we now can be saved
Yeah.
because of Jesus.
Yeah.
So whichever way we look at it, there is this um, coming out of darkness
Mm.
into this everlasting light. So I think that's the resurrection, whether it's through our own insight or through the power of Jesus to transform.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important point, and it speaks, kind of like mythically, even from the
Hmm.
idea that it's a different concept of time in a sense, and what I mean by that is that, um, driving around on Easter, go around and look on Easter Sunday and go by all the churches, they're not going to say, "Well, he rose." It's he has risen. It
Hmm.
is an occurring event now, still,
Yeah, yeah.
right?
The living Christ.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
Hmm.
it's a very much an immediate now thing still today. You
yeah,
know.
yeah, yeah. Um, all right. So there's a lot that can be said in terms of a lot of this. I mean, you can do whole courses on this idea of the resurrection and Easter and whatnot. But I think we've done a pretty good job of covering some of the core details of it. Um, Let me ask if, like, especially Jeremy, do you have any other remaining questions? And also, is there any other things that we may have missed, or any other final comments before we close this down for the day?
No, I don't have anything to add at this point.
Okay.
No questions.
All
I'm
right.
I'm satisfied.
Okay. Good. So if someone asked, if someone asked you, what's apocalyptic about Easter? Uh,
Well, let me send you to this YouTube video.
yeah. Very good. Very good. Yeah, that's the way to do it, right? I got to get them followers going. Um,
Hmm.
and I don't know. You've been typing away, and I hear things. Have people been commenting?
We had one commenter that was a little confused about what we were doing here,
Oh,
and
okay.
I don't know if you get to read the chat, but yeah, we could talk about that later, or you can go and
Okay.
watch the video and see what's going on.
Okay. Yeah, I will do that. Well, like I said, eventually that's what's going to happen.
Right,
And I think again, this is the point that the resurrection itself is, we all come from an academic background
right,
where, the there is, there's no real evidence for the resurrection. But
right.
probably, the best scholarly approach is like just agnosticism in a sense.
Hmm.
Um, and looking at placing everything in history and looking at the text and what can we know
Right,
by placing it within these contexts and within the context of the Jewish tradition and the history and everything that was going on. And
right.
I know, for having taught this for a very long time, that a lot of people are like, you're just wrong. This really did
Yeah.
happen and you're going to hell. And
Hmm.
I feel really bad for being in this class. So I don't know what I'm going to
Right.
do, um,
Hmm.
which is its
Right.
own challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't get to teach that anymore. But I did have to start putting a no witnessing clause in my syllabus.
Yeah. And part of it is if this is an academic discussion, which is kind of what we're doing here, it doesn't diminish a believer's
Right,
opinion on it.
right,
You can
right.
disagree with us, and that's certainly fine. But it may help you understand or deepen your own belief if you take some of these things into consideration.
Yeah,
Because these early
Yeah,
Christians, these early Jesus movement people, were wrestling with these same questions that you're wrestling with now. And if you think it's settled, then I think that's when you're at the end of your belief.
mm,
yeah. I think one thing that really truly is not known well amongst current Christian communities is that the early Christian groups were very diverse.
yeah,
Right,
And, they had very different understandings of it. And it's not until much later that we get, a canonized version of
right,
events that occurred.
right.
But it's okay if we have diverse opinions today about it.
Yeah,
hmm,
We could look at it scholastically, we can look at it theologically, and we're going to come up with different things.
yeah,
right,
yeah.
And it's all right.
Yeah, well, it's very popular in churches, is my understanding, to present that there was this original pure Christianity, and that
Yeah.
yeah,
we've just fallen away from that. It's like that's just
hmm,
nonsense. That never was the case.
right,
That it was just incredibly diverse. Um, and I don't know why there's resistance to that, but that's a topic
I
for
think
another
because
conversation.
I'd say it undermines their belief to
Yeah,
think
hmm,
that,
and
you have to start questioning a lot of things. If
yeah,
my version
hmm,
isn't the correct version that always existed, then what does that mean?
right.
right,
Yeah,
What else is wrong? You
right.
start
hmm.
opening that can of worms,
Yeah,
It also
yeah, and
underlines the political structures that's grown up around modern Christianity.
yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Well, and it's a thing that faith is not evidence.
Right,
You have faith in something, but that doesn't mean it makes it true. That's not the
right.
evidence. Yeah. So, all right. Well, we are at the end, I think. So, thank you both again for joining me here. I
Hmm.
think that the next month, we're doing some kind of environmental apocalypse.
Ooh.
I don't know that we
Okay. Yeah.
just in time for Earth Day.
Yay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, the one after that is the zombie apocalypse. So,
Nice.
um,
And Jesus will come up again.
yeah,
Or,
zombie
or maybe he
Jesus.
won't. I don't know.
Yeah,
He already rose. I guess he won't.
yeah, yeah. I don't know, but was he zombie? I don't know. Um, but yeah, we'll hash out the next episode over drink since Jeremy will be in Denver visiting. So
Yes.
yeah, we'll figure that one out. So anyway, thank you both, and thank everyone who's been watching
Thank you,
this
Nick.
and everything. And I
Thank
can't wait
you.
to see you both again.
Yep.
And don't forget to like and subscribe. If
Oh
you
yeah,
like the
like and
content.
subscribe. And I think that there's like a little money thing, so if you want, you can actually make some donations, or go to the Patreon too.
Hmm.
And also be sure to check out Jeremy's website, his YouTube channel, Kill Devil.
It has nothing to do with religion, but it has something to do with spirits.
Yeah, there you go. All right. Well, I'm gonna end this.